The stars themselves seemed to bend under the weight of absolute control. For 3,000 long years, the galaxy had known only one truth. The hegemony ruled everything, and their word was law. They had created something they called the Chain Protocol, a system so perfect that it decided the fate of every living being from the moment they were born. Each species had their place, their job, their limits. The Cathara were the administrators, their minds like living computers that tracked every single transaction happening across millions of worlds. With their crystal-like appearance and cold efficiency, they made sure every number added up perfectly. The Volgrim were the enforcers, massive beings whose very presence reminded everyone that the rules were not suggestions. Their heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors of power, carrying the weight of unchanging law. The Zinthi were the workers, their quick fingers and sharp minds, keeping the galaxy's infrastructure running smoothly. Day after day, year after year. This was not just a government or an empire. This was order itself, carved into the very fabric of space and time. No one questioned it because questioning was not allowed. No one dreamed of change because change was impossible. Every species, every world, every individual knew exactly what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to do it. Then came the day when human ships appeared on the outer edge of known space. The discovery sent ripples through the hegemony's vast bureaucracy. New species were not uncommon, but each one needed to be cataloged, classified, and assigned their proper place in the chain protocol. The process was routine, mechanical, had been performed 1,000 times before. The Kithara assessors arrived at the human colonies with their usual efficiency. They studied human behavior, measured their capabilities, and ran countless tests. To determine where these newcomers would fit, the verdict came quickly. Tier 7 maintenance. It was a low ranking, assigned to species considered suitable only for basic repair work. Simple tasks, limited tools. Nothing that could threaten the established order. Captain Juwan stood on the bridge of the colony ship New Sol, watching as the official classification was delivered. The Cathara assessor, a tall, crystalline being with eyes like faceted gems, handed him the assignment with the same indifference it might show to a maintenance request. Humanity would serve in the lowest tier of galactic society, fixing broken equipment and maintaining systems they were not allowed to. Understand. G1 accepted the assignment with a respectful bow. His people had traveled across the void seeking a new home, and if this was the price of survival, then so be it. The Cathara assessor seemed satisfied with his submission. Another species properly cataloged, another link added to the chain protocol. The hegemony officials departed, confident in their work. They had processed over 1,000 species in exactly the same way, and each one had found their place in the great machine of galactic civilization. Humans would be no different. They would accept their role, perform their duties, and fade into the background like all the others. The chains of order would hold, as they always had. The system was perfect, unchanging, eternal. Or so they believed. Commander Thrak had been doing routine inspections for over 2 centuries, and nothing ever surprised him anymore. The Volgrim Enforcement Division existed to maintain order, and order meant everything stayed exactly as it should be. Every species produced exactly what they were supposed to produce, used exactly the tools they were given, and never stepped outside their assigned boundaries. But something was wrong in Sector 7G. The massive Volgrim commander stood in the sterile inspection bay, his 4 eyes scanning the productivity reports that had been flagged by the automated systems. The human settlements in this sector had done something that should have been impossible. They had exceeded their productivity quotas by 12%, not just one settlement, but all of them. This was not a small problem. In the hegemony's perfect system, productivity quotas were calculated down to the smallest detail. They accounted for every variable, every limitation, every possible factor that could affect output. Species were given exactly the tools and resources they needed to meet their targets. Nothing more. Exceeding quotas meant someone was breaking the rules. His aide, a younger Volgrim named Kex, approached with a collection of confiscated equipment. The tools looked wrong somehow, different from the standard issue maintenance gear that humans were supposed to use. Kex held up a molecular welder, the kind used for basic repairs throughout the galaxy. "They have changed these tools," Kex reported, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and concern. "The power output has been increased by 40%. The focusing array has been completely rebuilt.
Ow.
These are not the same devices we issued to them." Thrax's four eyes narrowed as he examined the modified equipment. Minor rule violations were common among newly classified species. Some tried to hide extra food, others attempted to communicate with unauthorized groups. But this was different. This suggested planning, coordination, and worst of all, technical knowledge that humans were not supposed to possess. The modifications were not crude or accidental. They showed understanding of principles that were far beyond Tier 7 clearance. Someone had taken apart these tools, studied how they worked, and rebuilt them to be more efficient. That kind of curiosity was dangerous. Thrak ordered immediate surveillance of the human technician named Minjay, who had been flagged by the monitoring systems for asking too many questions. During routine maintenance calls, Minjay had inquired about the origins of the chain protocol, the history of the hegemony, and the reasons behind various restrictions. Such questions were noted and filed, but rarely investigated further. Now they seemed important. What the surveillance revealed over the following weeks defied everything the hegemony understood about species classification and control. The humans were not just breaking individual rules. They were systematically sharing knowledge across entire colonies, teaching each other skills that went far beyond their assigned parameters. In one recorded conversation, a human named Hyunwoo was explaining advanced repair techniques to a group of workers. These were not the simple procedures outlined in their official manuals. These were sophisticated methods that required deep understanding of the underlying technology, even more. Disturbing, the humans were asking questions about things that should not concern them. They wanted to know how the chain protocol was created, why certain knowledge was restricted, and what would happen if they ignored their assigned limitations. The surveillance reports painted a picture that made Thrak's blood run cold. The humans were not just curious individuals pushing boundaries. They were a species that refused to accept the limitations placed upon them. They were teaching each other, learning together, and growing beyond their assigned roles. For the first time in 3,000 years, the chains of the hegemony were showing signs of strain. The story of what happened on Nexus 7 was not supposed to spread. The hegemony had strict controls over information flow, and incidents like this were typically classified and buried in official reports that no one except the highest authorities would ever read. But the galaxy was vast, and news had a way of traveling through the cracks in even the most perfect system. It started with whispered conversations in cargo bays and maintenance tunnels. A Zenthi worker who had been on Nexus 7 mentioned to a friend that the humans had done something incredible. Kithara clerk accidentally included details in a routine report. Kavalgrim guard overheard a conversation and shared it with his unit. Each telling added new details, new emotions, new questions. The story that emerged was not just about technical expertise or rule breaking. It was about something far more dangerous. The possibility that the chains that bound every species in the galaxy might not be necessary at all. For 3,000 years, every being had been told that the chain protocol existed for their own good, that without it, chaos would consume everything. But if a group of Tier 7 maintenance workers could save 15,000 lives by ignoring the rules, what did that say about the rules themselves? On the mining world of Kepler 44-B, a Zenthi worker named Kexi sat in his dormitory after another 12-hour shift, staring at the tools he used every day. They were simple devices designed for basic or extraction and tunnel maintenance. When they broke, which they did regularly, he had to wait for authorized repair personnel to fix them. Sometimes that meant days of lost productivity, days of sitting idle, while perfectly repairable equipment gathered dust. But as he held the damaged plasma cutter in his hands, Xi found himself wondering something he had never wondered before. Why couldn't he learn to repair it himself? His fingers were nimble, his mind was sharp, and he had been using these tools for decades. He understood how they worked, how they felt when they were functioning properly, how they behaved when they were about to fail. What was it about repair work that made it so different from extraction work that he was forbidden to learn it? That question felt dangerous, but he could not stop thinking about it. Thousands of light years away, in the administrative centers of Proxima 7, Cathara clerk named Velthara was having similar thoughts. Her crystalline mind processed data with inhuman efficiency, cataloging transactions and maintaining records across dozens of star systems. But there were databases she was not allowed to access, files marked with restrictions that her clearance level could not bypass. She had never questioned these limitations before. Access levels were part of the chain protocol, and the chain protocol was absolute. But now, as she worked through her daily tasks, she found herself wondering what information was so dangerous that even she, with her perfect memory and logical processing, could not be trusted with it. What secrets were hidden in those forbidden databases? What knowledge was considered too dangerous for her to possess? The more she thought about it, the more the restrictions seemed arbitrary, designed not to protect information, but to control who could access it. These thoughts, these questions, these moments of doubt were spreading across the galaxy like a virus. Species that had accepted their limitations for millennia were beginning to dream of something more. They watched the humans with growing fascination, not because of their technical skills, but because of their audacity to imagine beyond their assigned roles. High Counselor Zeth Cole of the Hegemony felt the tremors of change rippling through his perfect order. Emergency reports flooded his office from across the galaxy. Productivity was declining as workers spent time asking questions instead of following procedures. Administrative errors were increasing as clerks tried to access forbidden information. Even the Volgrim were reporting incidents of hesitation, moments where orders were questioned instead of immediately obeyed. The threat was clear and present. Humanity was not just breaking rules, they were teaching others to think independently. The very foundation of galactic civilization was cracking under the weight of curiosity and hope. In the emergency session he called, Zethkill, S-Voice, carried the authority of 3,000 years of unbroken order. They must be contained, he declared, his words echoing through the chamber, before they destroy everything we have built. The sight of 200 warships assembling at the edge of human space was meant to inspire terror, and it did. Purge Fleet represented the combined military might of the hegemony. Vessels that had enforced order across the galaxy for centuries without facing serious resistance. Each ship was a monument to overwhelming force, designed to crush any opposition before it could take root. Admiral Kexmore stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Eternal Order, its massive form silhouetted against the tactical displays that showed every human settlement in known space. The Volgrim commander had overseen dozens of purge operations before, and they all followed the same predictable pattern: show of force, an ultimatum, and then either surrender or swift extinction. No species had ever chosen to fight back against impossible odds. The tactical computers had already calculated the optimal sequence of attacks. They would begin with the outer settlements, the small colonies that were furthest from Earth and least likely to receive support. Each target would be given the standard ultimatum: 3 hours to evacuate their world completely, abandoning everything they had built.
Wow.
Those who complied would be relocated to designated containment facilities. Those who refused would be eliminated. Begin with the outer settlements, Kexmore ordered, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Standard protocol: surrender or extinction. The first target was New Busan, a mining colony of 12,000 souls carved out of the harsh landscape of a distant world. The colonists had spent years building their settlement, creating homes and families in the darkness of space. They had followed every hegemony regulation, accepted their assigned role, and caused no trouble for anyone. But they had also been infected by the dangerous ideas spreading from Nexus 7. They had learned to question, think beyond their limitations, and to imagine possibilities that the chain protocol had never intended. When the hegemony fleet arrived in orbit above New Busan, the colonists gathered in the main hall to hear the ultimatum. The message was delivered with the cold efficiency that had characterized hegemony communications for millennia. 3 hours to evacuate. No exceptions. No negotiations. Dong Yun, a former engineer who had become the colony's unofficial leader, stood before his people as the countdown timer began. He could see the fear in their eyes, but also something else. They had spent months preparing for this moment, not because they expected to win, but because they refused to simply give up without a fight. "We have 3 choices," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We can run, we can surrender, or we can show them that humans don't break as easily as they think." The colonists chose the third option, something the hegemony had never encountered in 3,000 years of absolute rule. They chose to fight back. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. The colonists had no warships, no military training, and no weapons designed for combat. But they had something the hegemony's tactical computers could not predict. Desperate creativity born from the refusal to accept defeat. Mining charges, designed to blast through solid rock, became improvised explosives that damaged hegemony landing craft. Cargo haulers, built for transporting ore, turned into ramming vessels that crashed into enemy ships with devastating effect. Maintenance crews, who had learned to modify their equipment in secret, coordinated defensive actions that confused and frustrated the hegemony's rigid tactical systems. The colonists fought with tools and tactics that existed nowhere in the hegemony's vast military databases. They used their knowledge of the colony's infrastructure to create ambushes and traps. They coordinated their efforts with the same efficiency they had once applied to mining operations. They refused to surrender even when the situation became hopeless. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it ended, New Busan was gone, its buildings reduced to rubble, and its people scattered to the winds. But the cost had been far higher than anyone had anticipated. 6 hegemony warships had been destroyed or severely damaged by what were supposed to be helpless civilians. Admiral Kexmore stared at the tactical reports with something approaching disbelief. The humans had lost, as expected, but they had also proven that the hegemony was not invincible. It had fought with a ferocity and ingenuity that challenged everything. The military had been taught about inferior species. The purge would continue. But it would not be as simple as anyone had planned. The news from New Busan traveled faster than the purge fleet itself, and with each retelling, the story grew more powerful. 6 hegemony warships destroyed by mining equipment and cargo haulers. 12,000 civilians who chose to fight rather than flee. The impossible had happened. And suddenly the impossible seemed possible everywhere, on the industrial world of New Seoul. Manager Sujin stood in the control center of the largest manufacturing complex in the sector, watching as her entire world transformed before her eyes. The factories that had once produced consumer goods for the hegemony were now churning out weapons, armor, and defensive systems. But this was not just human ingenuity at work. Something unprecedented was happening. Zenthi workers, who had spent their entire lives following precise assembly instructions, were now designing new manufacturing processes. Their quick minds and nimble fingers proved perfectly suited for the delicate work of creating advanced weapons systems. They worked alongside human engineers, sharing ideas and techniques that had been forbidden for millennia. In the data processing centers, Cathara clerks were doing something that should have been impossible. They were actively sabotaging the hegemony's logistics networks, using their administrative access to create delays, redirect supplies, and scramble communication channels. Valthera, the same clerk who had once questioned the forbidden databases, now worked openly with human intelligence teams. Her crystalline form flickered with unauthorized data streams as she spoke in hushed tones to her human colleagues. "The humans teach us to see beyond our chains," she whispered, her voice carrying wonder and fear in equal measure. "They show us that we are more than our assigned functions." This was the hegemony's worst nightmare made real. The humans were not just fighting back. They were inspiring others to join them. The infection of independent thought was spreading faster than any military force could contain it. Across the galaxy, the resistance movement grew like wildfire. Cathara administrators who had never questioned an order began deleting crucial files and misdirecting military communications. Zenthi industrial workers turned their factories into weapons production facilities, using their knowledge of mass production to arm the growing rebellion. Even some Volgrim units, the very enforcers of the chain protocol, began to hesitate when given orders to suppress their own people. The warrior culture of the Volgrim, long suppressed by the rigid hierarchy of the hegemony, found unexpected kinship with human determination. These warriors had been bred for battle, but forced to serve as mere police, crushing the dreams of species who dared to think beyond their assigned roles. Now they saw in human resistance something their own culture had lost: the courage to fight. For what they believed in, Captain Brixen, of the Volgrim 7th Enforcement Division, stood before his troops, watching their faces as reports came in from across the galaxy. His soldiers, trained from birth to follow orders without question, were asking questions he had never heard before. Why were they fighting to preserve a system that crushed the spirit of every species it touched? What honor was there in destroying those who simply wanted to be free? Meanwhile, on Earth itself, the defense preparations took on an almost miraculous quality. Engineer Siogajin worked around the clock on the orbital defense platforms, coordinating with rebels throughout the galaxy to create a network of resistance that the hegemony had never imagined possible. From his position, high above the planet, Siochin activated the galaxy-wide communication system that the humans had secretly built using modified maintenance equipment. His message reached every corner of known space, broadcast on frequencies that the hegemony had never bothered to monitor, because they were supposedly beyond the capabilities of lower-tier species. "We are not breaking your chains to destroy you." His voice rang out across the stars, carrying hope to millions of beings who had never dared to dream of freedom. "We are breaking them to set you free." The message was more than words. It was a declaration that the age of the chain protocol was ending. The hegemony had created a galaxy where every species knew their place. But they had forgotten that knowing your place and accepting it were two very different things. The impossible defense was not just about protecting Earth. It was about proving that the chains that had bound the galaxy for 3,000 years were not unbreakable. They were just waiting for someone brave enough to strike the first blow. The siege of Earth was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. From space, the scene looked like a classic military engagement. Hundreds of hegemony warships surrounding a single world, preparing to deliver the final blow to a rebellion that had grown too dangerous to ignore. But what was happening in the depths of space around humanity's homeworld was far more complex than any battle in the hegemony's long history. This was not just humans fighting for their survival. This was the moment when 3,000 years of rigid control finally met its match in the form of liberated imagination. The coalition of chainbreakers had grown beyond anything the ancient order could contain or even understand. In the command centers of human defense stations, scenes played out that would have been impossible just months before. Cathera systems analyst Teth War, the species had been the administrators of oppression for millennia, now sat alongside human gunners, feeding them targeting data with the precision only her crystalline mind could provide. Her fingers danced across control panels as she identified weak points in hegemony ship designs, vulnerabilities that she had helped catalog during her years of loyal service. "Fire on grid, reference 7, Alpha," she would say, her voice calm and precise. "Their shield generators are clustered there. 3 direct hits will create a cascade failure." Meanwhile, in the fighter bays, Zenthi mechanic Gixpal worked with human engineers to modify their spacecraft with technology that had been forbidden for centuries. His nimble fingers installed power systems that pushed the fighters beyond their design limits, while his quick mind calculated stress tolerances that allowed the ships to survive maneuvers that should have torn them apart. The most shocking sight of all was in the space around Earth itself, where Volgrim Captain Brixstan led entire squadrons of defectors against his former comrades. These warriors had been the enforcers of the chain protocol, the ones who had crushed every previous rebellion before it could take root. Now they fought with the same intensity they had once used to preserve order, but this time they fought to destroy it. The battle was not just about military tactics or superior firepower. It was about the collapse of everything the hegemony had built. The thousand-year-old system that had kept the galaxy stable was crumbling. Under the weight of species who had learned to think beyond their assigned roles, deep beneath the City of Sol, the command center that had been built in secret over months of careful preparation, General Minciak watched the tactical displays with something approaching. The data streams showed not just the battle around Earth, but the complete transformation of galactic civilization happening in real time. They were not just defending their homeworld. They were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. Species that had never been allowed to speak to each other as equals were now sharing their deepest secrets, their greatest innovations, their wildest dreams. The Cathara were teaching humans about information systems. The Zenthi were showing them manufacturing techniques. The Volgrim were sharing combat strategies that had been classified for centuries. General Communications Officer Ariam called out, her voice filled with excitement and disbelief. "You need to see this. The chains are breaking everywhere. The hegemony is losing control of entire sectors." The tactical display updated with reports from across the galaxy. On the industrial world of Kepler 438b, Zenthi workers had taken control of the factories and were producing weapons for the rebellion. In the administrative centers of Proxima, Centauri Cathara clerks were deleting crucial databases and redirecting military supplies. Even on the hegemony's core worlds, Volgrim units were laying down their weapons and refusing to follow orders. This was not a military defeat. This was the complete collapse of a system of control that had seemed unbreakable. The chain protocol had worked for 3,000 years because every species had accepted their limitations and believed that their assigned roles were natural and unchangeable, but the humans had shown them something different. They had demonstrated that the chains existed only in the mind, that the limitations were artificial, and that the potential for growth and change was infinite. The siege of Earth had become the fulcrum upon which the galaxy's future balanced. On one side stood the old order, desperate to maintain control through force and fear. On the other side stood something new, something that had never existed before. A coalition of free beings working together not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. The breaking point had arrived, and there was no going back. Deep beneath the surface of the hegemony's most secure world, in a facility that had been built to survive the end of civilization itself, High Counselor Zethkal made the most desperate decision in galactic history. The reports flooding his command center painted a picture of total system collapse. Entire sectors had fallen to the rebellion. Species that had served faithfully for millennia were turning against their masters. The chain protocol, the foundation of everything the hegemony had built, was crumbling faster than any military force could restore it. There was only one option left. One final safeguard that the hegemony's founders had built into the very structure of galactic civilization. The Omega Protocol had been designed as the ultimate reset button, a weapon so terrible that it had never been used in 3,000 years of rule. But now, as the ancient order faced complete extinction, Zethkal prepared to activate the device that would end everything. The Omega device was not just a weapon. It was a carefully designed system that would eliminate all higher life forms in the galaxy, leaving only the most basic organisms intact. The surviving hegemony leadership, protected in specially shielded bunkers, would emerge into a clean slate. They would rebuild civilization from the beginning, but this time they would do it right. This time there would be no humans to spread their dangerous ideas of freedom and independent thought. But the device had one critical requirement that its creators had never imagined would become a weakness. It needed every chain to be perfectly aligned, every species locked in their predetermined role. The weapon drew its power from the very system of control that the hegemony had spent centuries perfecting. Each species had to be in their assigned position, performing their designated function. For the complex activation sequence to work, Zethkal's clawed fingers moved across the control interface as he initiated the startup sequence. The massive device, buried kilometers beneath the planet's surface, began to hum with barely contained energy. Status lights flickered green as the system checked each component, each connection, each link in the chain that would deliver galactic destruction. But something was wrong. The authorization codes that should have been processed automatically by Cathara administrators were not being entered. The power relays that should have been maintained by Zenthi workers were going offline. The security protocols that should have been enforced by Vulgrim units were being abandoned. Across the galaxy, the very beings who were supposed to make the weapon possible were rejecting their roles. Cathara clerks looked at their screens and simply refused to process the authorization codes that would end billions of lives. Their crystalline minds, trained for perfect obedience, had learned something new: the power to say no. Zenthi workers in power stations across dozens of worlds received the automated commands to maintain the energy flow needed for the weapon. Instead, they began systematically disabling the power relays, using their intimate knowledge of the systems to create cascading failures that would take days to repair. Even the Vulgrim, the ultimate enforcers of the chain protocol, began abandoning their posts. These warriors had spent their entire lives following orders without question. But now they walked away from their duty stations and left the weapon defenseless. The activation sequence began to falter as too many links in the chain broke simultaneously. The Omega device, designed to be absolutely foolproof, started experiencing feedback loops that its creators had never anticipated. The weapon that was supposed to end the rebellion began to tear itself apart. Zethkow watched in horror as his ultimate solution became his final defeat. The device that should have reset the galaxy instead became a monument to the power of free will. The energy meant to eliminate all higher life forms instead consumed the hegemony's last stronghold, creating a cascade of destruction that brought down the very foundations of the ancient order as the facility collapsed around him. Gel finally understood what the humans had really done. They had not just broken the rules or challenged authority. They had taught an entire galaxy that the chains of control existed only as long as people agreed to wear them. The age of chains was ending. Something new was beginning, something that had never existed before. A galaxy where every being could choose their own path. 6 months after the collapse of the hegemony, the galaxy found itself in a state of beautiful chaos. For the first time in 3,000 years, there was no central authority dictating how billions of beings should live their lives. There were no predetermined roles, no assigned limitations, no chains to hold anyone back from reaching their full potential. But with that freedom came an enormous challenge. How do you rebuild an entire civilization from scratch? The answer came from the most unlikely source. In the ruins of the old capital where the hegemony's grand halls had once echoed with the sounds of absolute authority.
Us.
Representatives from every species gathered to create something that had never existed before. The Free Worlds Confederation was not a government in the traditional sense. It was a voluntary association of beings who chose to work together because they wanted to, not because they were forced to. The meeting hall buzzed with voices speaking in dozens of languages, each one carrying ideas and dreams that had been suppressed for millennia. Former administrators sat next to former workers. Ex-enforcers shared tables with the rebels they had once hunted. The very idea of such cooperation would have been impossible under the old system, but here, it was happening naturally. Ambassador Gian of Earth stood at the center of it all, her presence commanding attention not through force or authority, but through the simple power of her words. She had been chosen to speak for humanity, not because she was the most powerful, but because she understood what this moment meant for the future of galactic civilization. "We offer not domination, but partnership," she said, her voice carrying across the vast hall and reaching every corner of the galaxy through the communication. Networks that had been rebuilt by cooperative effort. Not chains, but freedom to choose your own path. These words might have sounded like empty promises coming from any other species, but humanity had proven their sincerity through their actions when they could have taken control of the galaxy. After the hegemony's fall, they had instead chosen to help others find their own way forward. The transformation was visible everywhere. Velthera, the former Cathara administrator who had once been forbidden from accessing certain databases, had become a teacher. She traveled from world to world, sharing her vast knowledge with anyone who wanted to learn. The crystalline being, who had once enforced information restrictions, now believed that knowledge belonged to everyone. In the research laboratories and manufacturing centers, Zenthi engineer Gixpal worked alongside human dreamers to design technologies that would have been impossible under the old system. His nimble fingers and quick mind, once limited to basic maintenance work, now helped create terraforming systems that could transform dead rocks into living worlds. Perhaps most surprisingly, Volgram warrior Brickstan had found a new purpose in helping establish peacekeeping forces that operated on completely different principles than the old enforcement divisions. Instead of crushing dissent and maintaining order through fear, these new protectors focused on defending the weak and ensuring that everyone had the opportunity to pursue their dreams. The greatest change was not in what species could do, but in what they dared to imagine. Terraforming projects that had been deemed impossible under the rigid limitations of the chain protocol were now transforming entire star systems. Dead worlds bloomed with new life as species worked together to create gardens in the void. Scientific breakthroughs emerged from collaborative research that brought together the best minds from every species. The Cathora's perfect memory combined with human creativity and Zenthi engineering skills to solve problems that had puzzled researchers for centuries. Art, music, and literature flourished as cultures that had been kept separate for millennia began to merge and evolve together. The chains that had once held the galaxy prisoner had become raw material for building something unprecedented. A civilization based on hope rather than control, on freedom rather than order, on the unlimited potential of beings who were finally free to become whatever they chose to be. And at the heart of it all, humanity had proven that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is not ruling others, but teaching them to break their own chains and discover the power that had always been within them.